Evening, folks. The powers that be have asked me to let you know that there's some emergency exits at the front and back of the auditorium, as you can see, and there's to be absolutely no flash photography. That includes you, young man. That'd be Calvin, you know. Absolutely no cell phones, and never ever is smoking allowed on school grounds. Now we have the chairman of the Bicentennial Committee, Mr. Ed Dragoon, wants to say something. Is that right, Ed?
Well, I didn't come prepared for a long speech. I just wanted to thank all of you people on behalf of the Bicentennial Committee for the wonderful support that we've received over the past 6 or 7 months. We had a wonderful skating party. Biola had a tremendous day. West Chazy, Lee Sanger, Tony Trombley, and this will kind of wrap things up. And when I first was asked to take the job as chairman, I got home, my wife says, "What did you take that for? You know how much work is involved?" Well, there's a lot of work, but it's been a lot of fun. And I made a lot of friends, and I met a lot of people that don't mind working to make something happen in the town. So that's about all I have to say, except thank you. We're going to try to get something in the paper. We're not going to try to mention names because we started trying to do that, but the list kept getting so long that we didn't want to forget anybody. So we decided that we'd make it generic and just say thank you all for a good summer and a good set of events that made Chazy's Bicentennial special. I think this is going to be the biggest birthday party we've ever had in Chazy. Thank you.
Once again, thanks for coming, folks. We appreciate you coming out on such a cold and rainy night. I suspect most of you know me. I'm Seth Graves. I've been around Chazy for quite some time, ever since I came up from Connecticut back in '94. That's right, 1794 that is. I was here when they named the town. They named it after the rivers, you know, and I hear they were named after some young Frenchman got himself killed by the Indians long before my time. Now, the committee's asked me to explain to you folks what we're doing here tonight. We wanted to give you some idea of the early town, how it was when we come here, and what we got done to shape things up and make them livable. Now, we've asked a few of the folks who know something about it to come on up and talk a bit. Not too much, we hope. And tell us some of what they've learned from their folks who founded the town. One of them is my own relation. I'm mighty proud of him. He was postmaster once. Now, that's what we figured you'd like to know. What it was like to come here when there weren't nothing but trees. So I'll introduce the speakers as they come up, and some of them are a bit nervous, so we're hoping you'll make it as easy on them as you can. Now, our first speaker is Miss Biola Curry. We're honored to have her share her extensive knowledge of our history with us. Miss Curry never gets tired of studying the old days. We all know all you have to do is wind her up and let her rip. Miss Curry told me backstage that she's just realized that the Indians had a lot to do with Chazy before we came. But that is a story for another time. Meanwhile, here she is, our very own encyclopedia, Miss Biola Curry.
I've just brought a few of my resources for this evening, and I'm going to be delighted to share them with you. We'll start with the first of my books. By way of welcome, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to offer the congratulations of everyone on the Bicentennial of Chazy, and I'm very glad to be here tonight. to share with you some of the exciting,
may I say romantic,
parts of our past in this town. Now, history tells us that in 1609, Samuel de Champlain came and discovered Lake Champlain. The curtain which had been lifted was again lowered for 56 years. And in 1665, when Sieur Lemont, an officer in the French army, built a fort known as Fort Sainte Anne on Ile Lemont at the northern extremity. The same year as this event occurred, another which has given to Chazy an honorable and noble and ancient past. You see, Lieutenant de Chazy was a member of Carrigan's regiment, and he was stationed at Fort Sainte Anne. And one day, while hunting, not more than a mile and a quarter from the fort, he was attacked. He and his companion, Captain Travasset, were attacked by a band of Mohawk Indians. Travasset and de Chazy were killed. In memory of this event, the river was named the Chazy River. Now today we call that the Little Chazy, but when the town was chartered in 1804, the name was given to the town as well. 112 years later, in 1777, General Burgoyne came along the western shore of Lake Champlain, along with his army of 7,390 men and 1,500 horses. And they built a crossways of logs at for the impassable flats that were there, the mud flats that were in the area. And it covered from the mouth of the river all the way to Chazy Landing. This became the first settlement and business center for the town. Prudence Douglas was buried there in the very oldest and first of our cemeteries. Along with her were some of the first settlers: Timothy Sullivan, Jabez Ransom, Horace Morgan, Francis Chantenay, William Lawrence of West Chazy, Captain Ladd, John Douglas, and Nathaniel Douglas, most of whom settled in this area prior to 1800. Timothy Sullivan owned the first store in town. The first frame house in town was built in 1800 by Captain Ladd and is still standing today. In that house, Putnam Lawrence of West Chazy was born. This was in 1801. The house originally stood near a big poplar tree, which still stands today at the north end of Saxe's Stone Store. It served as a church, it served as a school, and also as a town hall. At the time, the chief means of transportation was the bateau. And when the neighborhood, which extended from the mouth of the river all the way down to the landing and Monty's Bay, decided to go to mill, the grist was collected and put on board a bateau, and a company of men would start rowing all the way from here to Whitehall, which is 90 miles south of here, it being the nearest of the mills. In 1800, William Lawrence built a rough wharf, constructed a tannery in town, and in 1807, he put considerable style on and added to the beauty of our town by building the first two-story house here. In 1807, 5 families, the heads being Septa Fillmore, a cousin to President Millard Fillmore, Levi Hazen, Eleazar Graves, Seth, our own, and John Bronson, moved from the Five Nations to what is now called the village. And it was also at this time, perhaps a year later, that Judge Matthew Sachs also settled in the area and built a new wharf that was located a few rods south of the one that had been built by Lawrence. Now, this landing became very important because it is the oldest landing for the steamboat, which is called Vermont, which was built in Burlington in 1808. Now, this is very important. This steamboat was the very first steamboat on Lake Champlain, and only the second in the world. And it was right here where we live. In September of 1814, Esquire Hubbell was permitted to go on board one of the British ships on the lake near Saxe Landing. And this was in anticipation of the Battle of Plattsburgh. Our fleet had been there prior to the summer and had decided to sail south for a while. He had been frequently on board and witnessed the drills that accompanied these ships, and as a result, he had had a fair opportunity for forming an opinion about the qualities of the two sides in this up-and-coming naval battle. The British officers knew this and had asked him what he thought the results of the battle would be. He told them, and this is incredibly important, that they would be defeated. Can you imagine? On the morning of September 11th, in 1814, Julius Caesar Hubbell started for Cumberland Head. And it was there, as he just arrived at that point, that he saw the British fleet coming around the head and was able to witness the Battle of Plattsburgh. Immediately after the surrender took place, he borrowed a skiff and he sailed out to the American flagship. And it was there that he was able to congratulate Commodore Thomas MacDonough on his victory. June 14, 1816, there was a heavy fall of snow. And the sleighing was good from the city all the way out to Plattsburgh Landing, all the way to Chazy Landing. All the way to Chazy Landing. Seth Graves came out in his big covered sleigh, and he had 4 horses, and as they moved along the snow, they noticed that it was getting much colder, and they were all out there, and they were having just a wonderful time as they were enjoying the ride out to Francis Champagne's inn, and there was a lot more to be said. I really have much more to say.
Thank you, Ms. Curry. Once again, you have given us an impressive version of all of your wonderful historical knowledge, and now we can move on. So, I'm forgetting myself by not thanking the committee for asking me to come up here tonight. However, I would have to say I think it's probably because they felt a little sorry for me, seeing that that road out there in front of the Presbyterian Church that they named for me, Graves Street, got changed a couple years ago. Changed into part of the Minor Farm Road. Funny thing to do. I guess I don't mind. Now we have something special for you. We have Miss Anderson, who will be telling us about her family, the Trombleys. Now, Frankie may be young, but she loves the old stories, and she'd be more than happy to tell us about them. Frankie.
Historical information with you tonight, but my grandfather, John Trombley, loved to tell stories. He told stories of his boyhood, of growing up, and of the olden days. My great-grandfather, Bruno Trombley, was one of the first settlers to this area. He was a native of Bay St. Paul, near Quebec, and he came to this area after the Revolutionary War in 1786. He came with his family in a canoe and traveled south through the rivers to Lake Champlain. They ended up settling in an area that we now know as Saxe's Landing, at a point just south of the dock. At the time, there were 2 other families living there, John Leframbois, the first white settler in our area, and another man by the name of Huot. It was not unusual at this time to see many Indians and Indian camps. The Indians were on very good terms with the settlers. Some of their favorite camping spots are all along the sand beaches along the lake. They like where Mr. Jones' cottage is located now, Robard, Bulls Point, and the beautiful bay that bears the Tremblay name. My great-grandmother, Francois, once told a story of a time when the Indians wanted to, they liked to trade for goods and milk and things like that. And she told a story one time when an Indian woman came to her wanting to trade for food and other goods, and she was carrying a child, and the child was wrapped in the most beautiful silk handkerchief that she had ever seen. And she really wanted it. So she asked the lady if she could buy it or trade extra things for it or whatever. She just really wanted that silk handkerchief. But the Indian woman, no matter what, couldn't be induced to part with it. And so the Indian woman explained to her the reason it was so important to her was that she used that handkerchief to wrap her children in when they were baptized. So it's very important to her. Bruno and Francois raised a family of 10 children, 9 boys and 1 girl. The elder boys were very active in the War of 1812. One of their sons was named John, and he was my grandfather. In 1803, he met and married Miss Genevieve Marney of Rouse's Point, and she's my grandmother. They settled and built a log cabin down in the Tremblay Bay area, small log cabin, and raised 11 children in that cabin. And one of their daughters was named Melissa, and she was my mother. The log cabin still stands today next to a large gray stone house that my grandfather built in 1827. And many a traveler were entertained or an immigrant as they traveled through this area. During the War of 1837, sometimes called the Patriot War, they entertained and gave shelter to the defeated Canadian soldiers as they were making their way home. Many a refugee would have fared very badly had they fallen into the hands of the British. The style of dress in those days was very plain and very simple. What my grandfather would do would buy a piece of goods and some leather and invite the tailor and the shoemaker to come to his home and create an outfit and shoes for each of his children. And believe me, that outfit and those shoes had better last to the next year. The farmers at the time, if they needed to have their grain ground, would have to carry it. So they would have to either load it into a canoe, in a wagon, or on their backs and carry it to Plattsburgh, because Plattsburgh was the nearest mill. These are some of our family stories, and I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Frankie. Miss Anderson, you can be proud to belong to one of the oldest families in Clinton County. Our next paper will be read by Mrs. Gilbert, our librarian. We all admire Mrs. Gilbert for her good work with temperance. But tonight she'll turn her attention to the early families of Chazy Village. Mrs. Gilbert.
My grandparents, Septa Fillmore and Eunice Edgerton, were married in Norwich, Connecticut in 1797. Grandfather came up in 1799, and grandmother in the winter of 1800. Her father brought her as far as Middlebury, Vermont, in a sleigh, and grandfather met her there. They were both from homes of comfort and perhaps luxury at the time, leaving brothers and sisters and a father's home to make a home in Chazy, then called the Five Nations, and almost a wilderness. I have heard my grandmother say, that if her father had known to what hardship and privation she was coming, he would never have given his consent. Grandfather built a log or block house with a roof over only one side and a dirt floor. The cooking was then done before an open fire or in a kettle hung on a crane. I've often heard old people wish that they could eat some of the good things cooked in that way. With the woods and wild beasts around them, Grandmother Eunice was sometimes left alone for 2 or 3 days when Grandfather would take his grist and that of his neighbors down to the lake, load it in a canoe, go to Onoa. There was a windmill there. She would take her 2 babies up the ladder at night, pulling it up after her, for there was no door, only a blanket downstairs, and the wolves were about. Pine knots were kept lit at all times to keep them away. The people carried torches when they went out at night. One can imagine there would be little sleep for a mother with little children under such circumstances. After a few years, my grandfather Septa built the main part of the present hotel where they lived several years and where he died. For months before the Battle of Plattsburgh, many of the officers boarded at the hotel. This made for lively times and hard work. At one time, they were obliged to bake several hundred loaves of bread, passing them out the window to the soldiers on their way to battle in Plattsburgh. And while everyone was waiting in suspense, a man came dashing through, saying, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" This proved to be a false alarm. But at the time, Grandfather was putting on his shoes and stockings. In his rush, he left one stocking behind, kissed Grandmother goodbye, jumped upon his horse, and rode for dear life. There was danger of his being killed by those in hiding, most of the way being a wilderness and filled with Indians and scouts sent by the British. The British had sent out a proclamation that all who would remain quietly and peaceably at home should not be molested. Grandmother Eunice thought at first that she would be brave and remain. But after Grandfather Septa left, and she had just her little family in care of the hotel, she became frightened at the fearful hooting and howling at night. Fearful for herself and her children, she decided to attempt to reach Plattsburgh. She piled bedding, clothing, and several little children on a big wagon and sent them on ahead. Then she took other things and followed, leaving her house with supplies of all kinds and all that they had gathered during their short married life. When the battle was over and the British had marched back to Montreal, sir, she returned to find only the bare shell of a house. Not a piece of furniture, no food, all the supplies taken or destroyed. Not a whole pane of glass, the front door riddled with bullets. A perfectly bare and desolate place. The only article found was an iron kettle up in the backfield. Every tree in the young orchard my grandfather had set out had been cut down. It was only the Freemason sign on the home that kept it from being burned to the ground. Thus, they were obliged to break in their life anew. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention to these reminiscences of the hardships and heroism of those stalwart people who have gone before us.
thank you, Mrs. Gilbert, for your dramatic presentation. How you managed to remember all those details is beyond me. Now, folks, our first musical interlude. Please welcome the Shape Note Singers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you've heard Mrs. Gilbert talking about the Great British Invasion, and you heard Miss Curry mention J.C. Hubble being there to see it in person, a genuine witness to all that bloodshed. Now let's hear from Esquire Hubble's own son to tell her what it was like to have the Redcoats right here in Chazy, John Wolcott Hubble.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. It's very kind of you to have asked me here. I've been asked to relate to you what I remember of the olden days in Chazy and what I learned from my father, Julius Caesar Hubble, who came here as a lawyer in 1808. My father was born in Massachusetts in 1787 and was one of 10 children. And the boys, as soon as they were old enough, large enough, had to get out and earn their own bread and butter. So my father was presented with a suit. The suit was spun and woven, colored by the daughters of the family, who also made the suit and fitted it. And at the age of 14, he left and moved to Champlain to live with his brother Silas there and study law. For the next 7 years, he studied law, and during that time earned just enough money to pay for his board, his food, and one law book. With this law book, an iron candle, snuffers, and one Yankee shilling in his pocket, he walked from Champlain to Chazy, following the marked trees, as there were no roads in those days, and it was all wilderness. In Chazy, he rented a room on the south side of the house owned by Mrs. Ninkler, next to Mr. McCain's store, and later on hired the whole house. In 1812, he married and brought my mother on horseback up Highland and commenced housekeeping. Later on, they moved into the stone house, 1812, and on that stoop, they both stood and watched Sir General George Prevost, Governor of Canada, and 12,000 troops as they came down to Plattsburgh. And my mother was also there when they retreated. A General Robinson and his officers were quartered in the house and agreed to pay my mother 1 crown for each meal, and they would supply their own wine and linen. My mother said that they were gentlemen, but still soldiers. Just before the battle, General Robinson told my mother that his father had explained to him that Americans were a very small people. My mother, being a very polite woman, agreed. However, she called for Philip Hunziker to serve the next course, which was the roast. And Philip Hunziker, at 6 feet 7 and 260 pounds, produced this for the general, who immediately laughed and said, "If the Yankees are all like this, then Lord deliver us from fighting them." Later on, however, the officers started to boast as how they were going to take Plattsburgh and go on to Albany and on down to New York. My mother, being patriotic and being a woman and able to say things, said, "You'll get no farther than Plattsburgh, you'll be whipped, and you'll soon be retreating." An officer said, "Madam, if you were a man, I'd run you through with my sword." The general, however, said, "You're very brave, and if what you say is true, then as we pass by, each one of my officers will throw down their purse at your feet." Well, the day of the battle, a courier came running up and whispered in the general's ear, and then another courier, and then another one. And they did not go back to Plattsburgh. They went on up to Canada. The general and his officers saddled up and rode off to Plattsburgh as fast as they could. And my mother heard one of the couriers say that the British were defeated. She went behind the door and silently cheered and swung her bonnet in her hand, fearing to do so more quickly. Soon the general and the officers were clattering back, and they had no intention of stopping. But seeing my mother on the stoop with her bonnet in her hand, at some command they all stopped, lined up, and threw their purses at her feet. They then saluted, turned towards Canada, and were never seen again. My mother excitedly picked up the purses, in which there was $1,000 in gold and silver. That evening, my father, much fatigued and upset, got up and built and through the window he saw a light in his office. He slipped on his clothes and ran across the lawn and looked in the window. The office was filled with British soldiers. They had taken 3 fence rails, put them into the fireplace, and were cooking a dinner in 3 pots hanging on the crane. All around the floor there were soldiers sleeping with their heads on their knapsack. 2 guards were pacing in front of the door, and when he approached they halted him, and he explained to them that he owned the building and he thought it was a fire. An officer came and questioned him, and he said, "All I want to do is protect my papers and my book." And the officer said, "They will not be touched, but please come in." He went in, and just beside the door there were 7 kegs of British gold. And outside he could see a wagon, the horses detached, eating their feed. He went back, and at 4 o'clock he made another trip to the office. The horses were gone, the soldiers were gone, and the gold was gone. The Presbyterian Church in 1816 was built at a cost, with sheds, $7,000, and was given by Alexander Scott, who lives in the house now owned by Mrs. Kingsbury. In 1807, 5 families had moved from Sax Landing, 3 miles west, to a place called 5 Nations. And the origin of this name is as follows, at least this is the rumor, that some traders from the south stopped at the landing to trade for furs, but were told by the innkeeper there, Old Chazy, that he had no furs, but 3 miles west there was an Indian village where they were sure to find what they wanted. They set off, and after 2 or 3 miles, all they saw was 5 men working on the road. They explained to them where they were going and what they intended to find, and they all laughed and said, "Oh, that's just one of Old Chazy's tricks." In 1818, the lot on which the Presbyterian Church stands was given by Gray, who also financed it, and also gave the lot for the school. The school was constructed in 1837 at a cost of $3,855. The first physician in the village was Dr. Carver, who settled in an area known as Carver's Corners, just south of here, across the road from the house which still stands there. He died in 1836, and I remember him well, for he had a way of making me take my medicine by giving me small pieces of red alder, which I very much enjoyed. I could go on for a long time with more reminiscences of the inhabitants, but I feel I have stood on what other people they should say. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Seems like we might have just solved some of the mystery of the Hubble money. It's always good to hear who built the houses in town and some of the old folks who lived in them. Now our next treat is Miss Minor, who also knows something about those days gone by. Miss Mary Elizabeth Minor.
There is very little that I can add tonight that has not already been said. My knowledge is limited, as my father left here when he was quite young. However, I remember some things he used to tell me when I was a child that were of great interest to me. My grandfather, Clement S. Minor, come here previous to the War of 1812, where he enlisted and served as a fife major. An incident occurred during the war when my grandmother was a child. British soldiers were passing by the house, and her father told the children to kneel down below the level of the window as to prevent them from being killed in case the soldiers fired into the house. My grandparents, after they married, they moved and came here to Chazy. They bought and lived in what is now known as the McCullough Place. The old yellow house, frame house, which is still standing there, was built by my grandfather. A custom related to me when I was very young was the mode of riding on horseback. When a woman would place a child in front of her on the horse and hold another in her arms. Later on, a wagon was purchased. I believe 2 or 3 families used to go to church in one conveyance. I've been told that when a wagon holding 12 to 15 children stopped in front of the church, it was called the load from the ridge. There's a difference in lighting of houses now and the way they lighted their houses years ago. We push a button and our houses are lighted by electricity. They use tallow candles, except on great occasions when wax ones were lighted. The tallow candles are made by placing candle wicking over smooth round sticks. These sticks were treasured from year to year as if they were gold. They would dip the wicking into hot tallow and then place the rods on spools for the tallow to cool. The dipping process was repeated until the candles were the desired thickness. This process lasted a number of days. Stores were not as plentiful as they are now, and goods were very dear. I remember I was told women came to houses and wove the material, enough to supply the family for some time. Blankets and bedspreads were woven also. A man going off to war needed a new suit of clothes, and it was necessary to have them right away. Within 48 hours from the time the wool was on the sheep's back, the man was wearing the clothes. The shearing, carding, spinning, and weaving, all happening in an incredibly short period of time by a number of dexterous hands. Preserving and drying of fruit precedes the glass jars and tin cans that we use today. Fruit was cooked pound for pound with sugar and stored away in crocks. Let us take a look into the kitchen of 60 years ago. We can see rings of golden pumpkins hanging on long poles driven into the ceiling. To the sides of the kitchen, we see strings, apples strung on cords attached by nails. Another look, and we see bunches of ripe and green peppers hung up to dry. And no housewife thought her larder complete without a barrel of cider applesauce flavored with cinnamon sticks. Lastly, physicians were not consulted as much as they do today, for they went to Mother Nature and laid in a supply of herbs, all different kinds, for every symptom and disease. Every mother did not consider that she had discharged her duty to her children until they had been exposed to whooping cough, measles, and mumps. No child had the blessing of earth until they had been through a siege of these maladies to prepare them for future health and happiness. Taking all this into consideration, it is a question: which are the happier people, they of old or we of new?
That's very true, Mary, very true. It does give us all something to think about. Now, most of you remember Esquire Rufus Heaton. Now, some of you may have thought he'd gone to meet his fathers. No offense, Rufus. And he's come all the way from Rouse's Point tonight to share with us some of his first-hand knowledge. And even though he's past his biblical age some time ago, we're happy to have Rufus share some of his first-hand knowledge of our history. Esquire Rufus Heaton.
Good evening, friends. Now, you'll have to excuse me for reading, because something as important as memorializing our predecessors, I want to have my facts straight. So, I prepared a little something here. Now, it's an imperfect sketch of the men who lived in Chazy and of events which occurred there during my childhood, boyhood, and early manhood. I can say what probably no other living man can say, that I was present at the raising of the Presbyterian Church in Chazy, which took place, I think, in 1820, possibly 1819. But the only incidents that I can remember were my mother, who was a member, was there and took up with her a pan of baked beans for dinner. Now, I presume my father was there too, but I have no recollection of it. The only other incident was I saw Plenty Moore climb up a rope to a beam when a man standing on the beam reached down and pulled him up. Plenty was about my age, perhaps a year older. Now, the next important event that I can remember was hearing the Declaration of Independence read on the 4th of July, 1826, in the Presbyterian Church. Bella Edgerton read it. Now, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both ex-presidents of the United States, died that day. But we did not hear of that day nor the next. We had no telegraph then. Now, among the professional and businessmen of the early settlers in Chazy, as I remember them, were the following. Dr. Nathan Carver, who was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1812. Bella Edgerton was a member of the Assembly in 1827, 28, and 29. Dr. Miles Stevenson was an Assembly member in 1833 and 34. Julius Hubbell was postmaster and a member of the Assembly in 1843 to 44. Mr. Hubbell was a sound lawyer and an honest man. Well, for fear I'm taking too much time, I will close now. Thank you.
Mr. Heaton, thank you for traveling all the way from Rouse's Point tonight. Now it's time for our second musical interlude. We have Alan Richardson performing a piano sonatina for us. Now, earlier you heard from Mrs. Gilbert. Now it's time to hear from her better half. J.W. Gilbert is our next speaker. Why, he and his wife together probably know more about the goings and comings in Chazy than any other two people in town. J.W. Gilbert.
That's right, Seth. Julia and I do manage to notice things, don't we, my dear? Let me begin by telling you a little about our Mr. Graves here. Julia and I think it's a pity that the powers that be have added Grave Street to the Minor Farm Road. It just doesn't make sense. It's an affront to one of our finest citizens. Maybe this wrong can be made right, although I know from my days as postmaster under President Cleveland that once a politician gets his hands on things, you can't make him let go. Let me tell you about Seth. Seth Graves came to Chazy from Connecticut. In 1807, he came up from the landing to where the village is now. At that time, there was but one road through a continuous woods, along a path in what is now known as the Fist Lot, where the schoolhouse stands today. The family stayed here till a more permanent residence was found. There were 9 children in the Graves family, all of them musical.
Must have got it from their mother, Jim.
The first saw and grist mills in town were built and owned by Mr. Graves. The first loaf of bread, made with local wheat flour, was baked by Mrs. Graves. He is a public-spirited and benevolent man. He gave the lot on which the Presbyterian Church now stands, deeded it to the congregation. He also contributed much to the building of the new church, to the point at which he depleted his own resources for himself and his family. The total gift was $2,100. It was through his efforts that the first bell for the church was obtained. He went to Troy for it. When it was landed at Sack's Landing, he brought it to the church in a two-wheeled ox cart. The lot the church was built on was once a cornfield. A few years ago in 1889, while digging in the basement of that church to install a new floor, evidence of those corn rows and stalks could still be seen. Mr. Graves was also a member of the first church building committee. With all this in mind, folks, it would be appropriate to put Grave Street back in its proper place. That's all I have to say, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Jim. Not sure what to say. I guess it's probably better to let sleeping dogs lie, huh? So, looks like it's raining Gilberts here tonight. We can't let the old folks do all the contributing. We've got this young rascal over here who wanted to have his say too. Young M.R. Gilbert's a bit shy, so he's brought his sister along to help him out a bit. Eunice and Matt Gilbert are going to be speaking to us about the Presbyterian Church. Please welcome Matt and Eunice Gilbert.
Our mother's earliest memory of the Old Chazy. Our mother's earliest memory of the Old Chazy Church, built in 1818, is of a crisp, cold winter morning some 70 years ago, when she, with her parents and others, drove to church from her father's farm, a distance of 4 miles in an ox sled. I fear we of a later generation would think this was attending church under difficulties. For you may not know that in those days it was not considered necessary to have a church warmed by artificial heat, depending rather on the fever of the spirit. At least our mother does not remember any such arrangement. It's a small wonder that our mother has a vivid recollection of her grandmother's little footstove, a small sheet iron box with a perforated top and sides in which was deposited red-hot coals. Mother also remembers the high pulpit and box pews. The first pastor who Mother remembers is Reverend Joel Byington, whose pastorate extended over 25 years. The first pastor called to the church was Reverend Stephen Kingsley.
I would like to add my own vivid recollections of the church of my childhood. The imposing facade as we drove up to the church steps, the fine wooden pillars, and a gable-shaped pediment making it appear somewhat like an old Greek temple, while the memories clustered inside its walls are numerous. There was Mrs. Mygack's class for Bible study for young girls, and that of Mrs. Warden as well, and her sister, who led the class later. I always had great admiration and respect for them both, for they did much to lead my life towards right ways. Though still very faulty and incomplete, what might it have been without them? Now, my union with the church came in under the Reverend Mr. Abbott. Later, the Reverend Mr. Myers led my thoughts up to God. Our father was deacon for many years, and I can still see his pleasant face and familiar figure walking down those aisles, while our well-filled family pew I know I shall never forget. We are finished, Mr. Graves. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Matt and Eunice. You did a fine job. The Gilberts can be proud of you both. Now let's turn to Dan Dunning.
A few lines about East Street have been assigned to me on this occasion, and after making inquiries of some of the older people of the town, I am again strongly impressed that most of us know but very little of our ancestry. Most farmers have knowledge of more generations of their cows and horses than they do of themselves. Many of my cows that I have owned can I give between 1 and 2 dozen names of their ancestors. One cow of which a tabulated pedigree was sent me containing some 60 names of her progenitors. And yet, I was in recent conversation with a college-bred young man born in this town who could not give me the given names of one of his grandparents. Now, the Stetsons were Baptists, and the Dickinsons, Methodists and Presbyterians. And the Dunnings were neither exclusive nor restricted, they being Universalists. I have here a prayer book of one of them. The Dickinsons came here from Washington County, New York, in 1800. My grandfather, Eli Dunning, was born in Waterbury, Connecticut in 1772. And the Stetsons came here not long after the Dunnings and the Dickinsons. The first families that came here, when the first families came here, there were but bridle paths to the woods, with trees spotted to guide the way. In time, the roads were wide enough to allow the passage of an ox cart, which often contained the whole of the household goods. My grandfather, when out amongst the woods, before building his first house, coming upon a stone, would place it on a stump, thereby saving everyone towards the building of his chimney. Now we need not be so saving or economical with our stones. In fact, having to look sharp to find a small bit of ground without one. Now the young people here may not remember that Mr. Treadway owned and operated a woolen mill in Suckertown. There was also there a stone mill where stones were sawed. Stones for the purpose being brought from Isle Lamont. About my premises there are still many pieces of its work which are in frequent or constant use. Among the incorporators of the Presbyterian Church were Thomas Cooper, Luke Broadwell, and Matthew Sachs, the latter of which was a trustee of the church as late as 1818. And so you see, there is first-class Presbyterian blood in the Saxons. No wonder they may now make such excellent Methodists. And are useful citizens, whom we all esteem and respect. Well do I remember the families of William Sachs and Hiram Ladd. They were regular attendees of the church, occupying pews in the northeast corner of the church. In the stone schoolhouse, much farther back than my memory allows, were held religious services, Sabbath school preachings, and protracted meetings. Preachings by Methodists, Presbyterians, Universalists, Adventists, and Baptists, and probably others. But by far the most noteworthy meetings to have taken place on the street were the prayer meetings, which have been more or less continuous for some 40 years. Many years of the time being held, some with regularity, some 9 months out of the year. There have been many changes to death or removal of the people of the street. Thank you, Mr. Gray. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been my pleasure to be here tonight.
good to listen to someone who can put together the spirit with good business. Now it's time for our third musical interlude. Please welcome Mr. Staub Spiegel, also known professionally as SGS. Staub.
Chazy Town was born. Five hamlets started to grow. Chazy landed with boats in tow. And Lawrence Corners and Lawrenceville's were West Chazy's first name. And Scioto was Ober's Corners of railroad station fame. There's a town I want to sing about, a town so close to me, a town that's given me so much, a town of memory. Chazy is my town, my town. It's apple blossom sweet, with white cap ripples on the lake. Nicer people you'll never meet. In Ingraham, known as Samson, the postal office opened its doors. Chazy Village was called Five Nations through 1880 and more. And Lawrence Corners and Lawrence Mills were West Chazy's first name. And Scioto was Ober's Corners of railroad station fame. There's a town I want to sing about, a town so close to me, a town that's given me so much, a town of memory. Chazy is my town, my town. It's apple blossom sweet, with white cap ripples on the lake. Nicer people you'll never meet. Nicer people you'll never meet.
song. And our next speaker is Mr. Albert Bugbee. Now, Albert's a good friend of Dan Dunning's and of us all. And let's have a big hand for Mr. Albert Bugbee.
In 1801, John Bugbee and Hannah Tracy, his wife, decided to leave their home in New Haven, Connecticut to make a new one in what was then called the Far West. They traveled by oxen team, and after several long, weary days over rough roads, they arrived here, God's country, northern New York. They built a small log cabin, cleared a couple acres of land, and burned the timber to make potash, which he took to Montreal in a small boat from Chazy Landing, and got supplies for the coming year. The next season, he planted the clearing of corn. He raised a good crop, which he carried to Champlain to mill on his back. Now, John built a sawmill on the Tracy Brook, which, with the help of his two sons, he ran for several years. Now, in the wintertime, their job was to stock the sawmill with logs that they had cut during the spring and summer. Now, the Tracy Brook, which currently has been dry for 2 weeks this year, supplied enough water to run the mill day and night till the middle of June. And after that, as the brook began to run dry, it only supplied enough water to run the mill for a portion of each day. Now, let me point out a few interesting facts showing the contrast in customs between those days and now. All families were raised in a Presbyterian faith, and with the Sabbath from sundown on Saturday till sundown on Sunday, but during which time we weren't even allowed to smile. On Sunday, we were obliged to read 5 chapters of the Bible. On Sunday morning, the old gray horse and double wagon would come pick us up for church. The entire family would pile in, young and old, and when the wagon was too full, the children had to get out, put their shoes in their hands, and walk to church, putting them back on when they neared their destination. Now, our pew was in the corner. We would go in, close the door behind us, and when the children wanted to see out, they had to stand on the footstool. Now, the clothes we wore back then were different from what we wear now also. I well remember marching down the aisle in my little white Marseille frock coat with a collar 16 inches wide and a skirt 4 inches long. There was 4 big white buttons that covered the pockets underneath. Now, church consisted of 2 services with an hour intermission, at which time we ate our lunch. I remember sitting there during the afternoon sessions, patiently, or impatiently as the case may be, listening to various heads of the sermon, from First League to 25th League, and back to First League. Now, outside, the shed was filled with double wagons. And as I recall, the first carriage in town belonged to Squire Hubbard, and it was considered a marvel of beauty. How glad we were to climb into the wagon and go home to dinner. On Sunday evening, after the sun went down, the hats went up and hurrah for a good time. Now, the first chore on Sunday evening was to whip the vinegar barrel for working on the Sabbath. Now, few took a newspaper, and books were not plenty, and the mail only came once a week. Winter evenings were spent visiting neighbors, all the families taking turns entertaining all the others. Now, refreshments were always served, my favorite part, usually consisting of tea, brown bread, pumpkin sauce, shortcake, and honey. Now, once in a while we would serve just plain sweet cake, with no frosting, but normally the cake was just Johnny cake. Now, apples were not plentiful then, but when they occasionally were served, it was considered quite a treat. Now, it was common custom back then for both men and women to smoke pipes and take snuff, with the snuff box being passed around quite frequently. Now, I have many recollections, but as I see, I've already used my 5 minutes, so I will simply say, I do not long for the good old days. Thank you.
Now, folks, we're coming to the bottom of the barrel, but that don't mean the cider's turned to vinegar. Our next speaker will bring some spice to our entertainment, telling us about her relatives, the Norths. Mrs. Helen North Dill.
Tennyson, in In Memoriam, speaks of the eternal landscape of the past. In reviving the memories of Old Chazy, I have been asked to give a brief account of the North family and the role they played in the early settlement of Chazy. In order to do so, I must go back to the Honorable Abijah North and his younger brother, Lemuel North. And although the former accumulated a good property in Chazy, I must quote from the History of Clinton County, page 261, where it says that among the representative families of Champlain, none are more deserving of an honorable place among the pages of history than this family. The Honorable Abijah North family came to this country previous to the Revolutionary War. They settled in Shoreham, Vermont, where the Honorable Abijah North was born in 1772. He was reared a farmer, which honorable business he followed for the rest of his life. He commenced life poor, but by indomitable energy, combined with economy, he rose in time to become one of the most influential men of Clinton County. These two brothers, the Honorable Abijah and his younger brother Lemuel, worked together until they had accumulated 720 acres of the finest farming land in Champlain. Abijah was a successful farmer and was known far and near as a fine breeder of cattle and horses. He was a Jeffersonian Democrat, a leader of his party in his town, and held numerous offices, such as magistrate, supervisor, and loan commissioner. And in 1838-39, he represented his constituents in the legislature. His younger brother, Captain Lemuel North, commanded a company of cavalry in the War of 1812. He later moved into the brick house across the bridge, formerly known as the Douglas Mansion, and recently purchased by S.S. White. He married Levi Fillmore, daughter of Seth Fillmore, who was a cousin of Miller Fillmore, a vice president and president of the United States. I have thus described the North family. Its influence extends to the present day, as is well known to all. But no account would be complete without some description of everyday life in the times of which we speak. One of the industries of the day was making potash from wood ashes and taking it to Montreal to be sold. The women of the day, when berry season was over, made sorrel pies, beguiling the appetites of their families. How they managed to sweeten them is a matter of conjecture. Men and women worked long hours with very few holidays, and of course a very special day was Thanksgiving. And the life of people in those days was very well described by Alexander Pope, who said, "Our rural ancestors, with little blessed, patient of labor when its end was rest, indulged the day that housed their annual grain, with feasts and offerings and a thankful strain." I would like to end with a quote from Emerson, followed by a quote from the Bible. I am sure that we all agree with Emerson when he says, "We cannot overstate our debt to the past, but the moment has the supreme claim. The past is for us, but the sole terms on which it can become ours are its subordination to the present." And, as the Bible says, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that the days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee."
Your learning is certainly impressive, Mrs. Dill. I'm sure we all agree with you that the spirit of this evening is to honor those who came before us to found this town. Our final presenter tonight is Mrs. Migan, who has herself been witness to so much of the history of our town. We're happy to say we have a speaker with us tonight who was born the very year of the Battle of Plattsburgh, Mrs. Migan.
To bring this splendid program to an end by sharing with you some of my pleasant memories of Old Chazy. My earliest recollection of this, my native place, aside from my home and school companions, are connected with the church and its pastors. The first minister I can remember was the Reverend Joel Byington, and it was during his pastorate that the old church was built and the bell was bought and put up about 1824. I remember when the bell was hung in the belfry. It was a gala day with the children. We girls were all wearing lovely dresses with red, white, and blue sashes streaming in the wind, our hair flying as we ran up and down the street, delighted that we had been permitted to participate in the celebration of the day. The boys were all at the bell, which was rung at intervals all day. I remember seeing Seth Ways sitting on the step in Father's office, radiant and excited as he gazed out at the church and the bell, for he gave the land on which the church now stands and contributed liberally to the building of the church and the purchase of the bell. I recall Father saying, "There is one happy man in town that day."
Yes, sir.
The old church was a quaint structure with a wide lobby across the front and an entrance by 3 outside doors. There were 4 large pillars or columns in front, which served to support the belfry and was considered an imposing ornament. There were 10 windows on each side, 5 above and 5 below, with 4 in the north end and 3 in the front gallery over the entrance. There were neither blinds nor shades, and therefore nothing to interrupt or obscure the light of heaven. Inside, the pulpit was a high octagonal structure, much like a bird cage, which projected from the space or platform behind where the minister sat. It was supported by 2 tall fluted columns with ornamental scroll capitals, and a flight of steep stairs on each side led to the pulpit. It was taken down in after years and replaced by a lower platform with a desk. The pews on each side of the middle aisle were wide slips, and those against the wall were square pews, so high that I remember my uncle Amasa Moore once saying the congregation looked like they were all in swimming. I also remember that the church was heated by box stoves, and these were placed in a space near the entrance, and the long undulating pipes led into the chimney on the north. On the east side, and half the space in front, sat the soprano and alto singers. And on the west, and corresponding space in front, sat the male singers. Also, Hiram Brockway with his bass viol, and Mr. Minor, grandfather of the present Miss Minor, with his fife or flute. And I dimly remember a violin or bass viol being played by one of Captain Ransom's sons as well. Voices. The voices were true and well trained in time. Once the hymn was given out and the pitch was given by the conductor with a pitch pipe, as the tune started, the singers would commence to move with a weaving and swaying motion, side to side, in the time of the tune, either fast or slow. And this continued until the last line of the hymn. The congregation rose and faced the singers.
Singers and musicians, and Mrs. Mygat. Thank you very much. Now, folks, as we wind things down here tonight, let's take this opportunity to thank all the nice folks involved tonight. Let's have a big thank you for all of our presenters. How about our fine musicians and singers? And our talented pantomimers. And those hard-working folks backstage. everyone. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, now that we've got y'all standing, let's not forget the real reason why we're here tonight. Why, this is the 200th anniversary of our town. And it's only proper and fitting that we wish happy birthday to our town in just the right way, which is to sing Happy Birthday, Chazy. For you. The ladies have been working hard, so we'd like you to all turn around and look back toward the cafeteria. We've got your cakes for